Hello and welcome to another episode of Strait Talk with me, Tom Reed, head of oil market analysis here at Argus, and my brilliant colleagues, John Ollett, head of EMEA Freight, and Nada Ithayim, head of our Middle Eastern editorial department. Today, we're talking about the US new plan to isolate Iran economically rather than militarily, which has come as a bit of a relief to everyone. Scant consolation, of course, for the long-suffering Iranian people. But we are also talking about Iran's own policies. It has come up with a new plan to administer the Strait of Hormuz traffic and claims to have Oman on board with this. And of course, we're going to get the latest best guesstimate from the legendary Mr. Ollett on how much oil he thinks is getting out of the strait currently. That clearly is the greatest unknown in the oil market today. It's keeping volatility measures up above 60%. It's pushed up prices of the Dubai benchmark to over $98 a barrel earlier this week, and it's caused prompt Dubai to jump by nearly $8 a barrel against forward contracts, signaling a super tight market. So, Nada, Washington has threatened Iran with some sort of economic D-Day. What more can the US do, though, in terms of attempting to isolate Iran economically?
It's a good question. And I think probably many people in Iran even have the same question. Iran has been one of the most, if not the most heavily sanctioned or sanctioned country on earth for the last 3 decades, almost ever since the Islamic Republic's inception in 1979. So particularly over this period, you know, since Trump's first term in office, I mean, sanctions have been cranked up to levels that we've never seen before. We've heard this kind of rhetoric as well, you know, that the most crippling, the most serious, the most damaging sanctions ever. So I'm not necessarily sure that, I mean, in Tehran itself, these announcements are making the impact that the US would have hoped for. I mean, many in the US as well are also questioning really what these announcements even meant, because many thought this would be an immediate kind of announcement of sanctions that are going to take place, and Iran will start to be squeezed immediately. But obviously, this was more of a warning as to what could come, and this announcement essentially seemed more focused towards, you know, other countries rather than Iran. Iran already has been sanctioned to the teeth. There's not much left there, and it hasn't been for a while. So the question now is, these other countries, and particularly Russia and China, do they essentially play ball? And do they...
Interesting. I mean, last time the US tried to exert economic pressure on China through the trade war, I think a lot of people considered that backfired, and the US is forced to back down. I mean, right. Might it go after regional trading partners? I'm thinking UAE, I'm thinking Turkey, I'm thinking Iraq. What are the risks to those countries now?
Look, we've all seen the numbers in terms of who Iran's biggest trade partners are. Yes, you've rightly mentioned that there are regional countries, countries in the region that have been engaging. Look, the UAE in particular came out about a week ago now and basically formally said it's cutting off all economic ties with Iran. It almost preempted the announcements to sort of clearly state its position. Now, obviously, what that means in practice, it's anyone's guess. Only time will tell. But there's a clear, I mean, the Gulf countries, both politically and economically, they have decided a while back now that they need to make sure that their interests are put first, and they're going to basically try and safeguard themselves in whatever way that they can. So, you know, I imagine the UAE in particular and other Gulf countries are going to absolutely play ball to the extent that they can with the US. That is clear. I mean, these are longtime, allies of the US. It's more, like I said, the question is more around the likes of China and Russia. So maybe, Tom, what do you think? I'm going to throw a question at you for the first time in how many podcasts?
I don't think it's going to work.
You don't think, or you think it is? Go for it.
I don't see China playing ball. I mean, Beijing came out, the foreign ministry said, you know, we reserve the right to deal with our trade partners and perceived allies the way that we want to, pretty swiftly. So, yeah, and we've got this meeting coming up between Presidents Trump and Xi Jinping. And, I would imagine that Mr. Trump wants to come back from that with some sort of a win. But on the other hand, given the cards that China has, I'd be surprised if he really wanted to push his luck there. I think one important consideration, which I'd like to just hone in on, of course, is the situation in Iran. Clearly, we've got the US blockade ongoing that's strangling oil revenues. How is Iran's economy faring in terms of inflation, fuel shortages? And what are the chances that further economic hardship, imposing economic hardship, will shift the very hardline maximalist approach that we have seen from Tehran with regards to its negotiations with the US?
Yeah, so I mean, economically, Iran has been basically has been strangled, or has been strangled for many years, many decades. The situation economically has been deteriorating for a while now. I think even before the start of the war, the situation was incredibly dire. Financially, there was a financial crisis, there was a electricity crisis, there's a fuel crisis, there was a water crisis. So Iran was in bad shape to begin with, and there's no doubting that the last 6 months have only made things worse. Now you can question how much worse could they have gotten, and how much worse could they get. Look, Iran, at least the government of Iran, they have, as I said, they have been functioning and managing the country and economy under sanctions for decades. If there is any country, as in, let me put it this way, they are probably the best equipped country on earth to handle the kind of economic pressure that is being put under them. Is this a situation where they could do this forever? Absolutely not. And there is an expiry date to how long they could take and handle such pressure. You mentioned, the blockade. One thing that has been a regular kind of, flashpoint in Iran is gasoline. Iran is a massive gasoline producer, right? It can produce significant volumes of gasoline, and up until maybe 10 years ago, it was a net gasoline importer. But then it started to essentially build some more condensate splitting capacity, and it got to a point where it was a net exporter for some years. But recently, because of the incredible growth of gasoline consumption in Iran, I mean, despite everything that the government has tried to do, prices essentially are so low that people overuse. So consumption has been growing. And again, we're now at the point where some months of the year, Iran has had no choice but to import to kind of, top up and meet domestic demand. So you remove those imports with the blockade that's coming in, you're going to have problems. And already we're hearing a lot out of government officials about, what could happen. People are asking, could the subsidies essentially get cut? Could prices rise? What are we going to expect as the Iranian population? So far, they're not giving too many hints, but something essentially is going to have to give. To Todd, the last thing I want to say is, you were saying, could this pressure, result in a change in the way that the government acts? Look, I don't think so. But my worry here is that it seems, at least out of the US, that, with the shift towards economic warfare, so to speak, there is a sense that the days of the kinetic warfare are over, right? The problem is that if this economic pressure continues for a matter of weeks, months, and we do get to the point that Iran does feel the squeeze in a very bad way, or much worse than it is today, the Iranians will have to do something. And that something, I fear, would ultimately be going back to a state of hot war, in the sense that doing something to essentially turn or tip the scales back in its favor. It can't do anything economically. It's going to have to go back kinetically, especially knowing that the US is not interested in the kind of thing. Probably makes it more appealing for Iran. So that's my concern here. That's how I think it could change behavior in Tehran.
Yeah, a pretty dismal prospect indeed. Now, John, much ink, tears, and indeed money have been spilt on the question of how much oil is getting out of the strait now. I've seen estimates of anywhere between 2.5 and 6 million barrels a day, which I think, it goes a long way to explaining why we're seeing such high volatility measures in crude futures. Where do you put it? What would be your best estimate there?
The ultimate question. Well, I mean, actually, there are certain parties in the US that are claiming up to 9 million barrels a day. So, truth is, some of the key countries, Iraq, Kuwait, etc., not Saudi Arabia, let's exclude them for the moment, are coming out with about 1 million to 1.5 million barrels a day. So it adds up to 4, tending up towards 5. However, 1 million barrels a day or 2 million barrels a day sounds like a huge number, but it's important to remember that a VLCC carries 2 million barrels. So 2 million barrels a day is one ship. 4 million barrels a day is two ships. So 5 million barrels a day is 5 ships over 2 days. So that's not actually that many ships. And traditionally, it should be more like 12 million barrels a day, excluding Iran. So add in Iran, which is now shipping pretty much nothing through the Strait of Hormuz, you're looking at maybe 14, 15 million barrels a day. So even though it sounds like a very, very big number, and, you know, it's a lot bigger than zero, it's still not a massive number. And what's key there as well is kind of who is moving it. You know, a lot of it is coming out of Basra. A lot of it is coming out of Kuwait. Ras Tanura, Saudi Arabia hasn't really started sending out a lot yet. So it's still pretty kind of slow there. It's also important to look at what route they're using. They're still mostly using the Omani route, where they can.
The southern corridor, as it's
precisely.
Yeah.
Yep, exactly. Round the coastline. So there's still not a lot using the Iranian route, and there have still been vessel strikes. But
I think that's a fascinating question. Can I just ask you about that? So, I mean, we've seen Iran attack vessels for using that southern corridor, and yet they're still using it rather than the Iranian one.
Yes. So it seems like there's maybe 1 or 2 strikes a week, and it appears that there's essentially, the theory is that there's 2 categories. There's a category that Iran will hit and won't hit. What distinguishes those categories is then very important, and that's the kind of ultimate question. Is Iran not able to hit every ship, or is Iran choosing not to hit every ship because there is another arrangement in place? Given some of the actions that we've seen recently, it's potentially the latter. But what is key here is that they're not using the Iranian route, they're still using the Omani route, and that remains the main avenue out of the Gulf. The second thing is that this has been growing, mostly growing. This has grown throughout October since, as Nada said, we've kind of moved away from the more kinetic portion of this war, but it is very heavily dependent on that. If the shooting starts again in earnest, at the moment it's kind of an occasional strike. If it goes up to more strikes, then all of this crude will stop flowing almost immediately. We are seeing some people operating in the spot market. They're coming out. Sinocor is particularly active here. So there's actually, traditionally in July, for example, the crude producers would only be using their own ships, which they control and they can dictate where they go. But now we've actually got a major South Korean ship owner doing spot deals to go through. And we've even seen some of the big traders, Trafigura and Mercuria, they're now booking even Sinocor ships on spot. So it's the first, almost a return to normalcy. But it is very heavily dependent on whether or not there's going to be more kinetic activity, or whether we're moving into a economic sanctions portion of this war, where more crude will potentially start to flow.
Sorry, I mean, I interrupted you there, and it just raised a fascinating question. I think one of the questions I had was, do you notice a change in the, I guess, the ratio of countries getting their oil out? And I think the other one, and I think you kind of really queued up this question, is the PGSA, the Persian Gulf Strait Authority that they set up to manage the Strait of Hormuz, this month took a leaf out of the US Treasury's book and began sanctioning vessels itself. Can you break down for us what a PGSA sanction entails and whether that is having an effect on the types of the origin of the countries getting their crude out?
Sure. So let's deal with the ratios first. Iraq leads the way. It's the first return to shipping stuff through the strait or shuttling stuff through the strait after any kinetic activity. It's done that on numerous occasions. Kuwait is normally the second. They use both their own Kuwait mostly uses its own ships. Iraq uses a mix of its own controlled ships and spot ships. Saudi Arabia is normally the last, but Saudi Arabia, and has only started in the last kind of week. Saudi Arabia, though, it's worth saying, also has Yanbu. So you know, it doesn't have the same pressure on it potentially that somewhere like Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar would have. Qatar has also been active. So Iraq is the number one exporter at the moment, closely followed by Kuwait. Saudi Arabia has done, I think they've got 2 ships so far. They've got a further 6 loaded. So they are coming back in a big way. So then we have the PGSA, and essentially as it feels like I say this every week, everything changed in the last 48 hours because it always does. That's why we do it on this day. But the PGSA came in and sanctioned ships that are doing STS transfer. So it looked at the ships and it said, if you are shuttling through the strait, STSing onto a mainstream ship, and that ship is then going to its final destination, we are no longer happy about that. And it sanctioned 45, 46 ships. It looked like it sanctioned one ship twice under two different names. Now, the mix of what those ships are doing is particularly interesting.
Can I just interrupt you briefly? So that we know why the PGSA sanctioned these ships. It was for doing STS transfer. Is that?
Yes, and it said that. It said that. So that is the reason that it gave.
Do we know why it doesn't like that?
Essentially, I would imagine it's because a lot of their leverage is starting to slip out. So the shuttling and STS trade has become much more buoyant in the last kind of 2 to 3 weeks. In July, it was sporadic, but now, and it was sporadic, and it was mostly Iraq and Kuwait. Now it's Iraq, it's Kuwait, it's Qatar, it's the UAE, it's Saudi Arabia. Now everybody's doing it. And it appears that the PGSA is starting to push back against that. And this is also what we've seen before. Whenever that traffic through the Omani route reaches a certain level, it's not a specific level, it's whatever level Iran feels uncomfortable with. As soon as it reaches a level that Iran feels uncomfortable with, they either start a fresh round of strikes, as they did at the end of July, or they when the IMO policy went through, again, it led to a lot of strikes. So they monitor the traffic through the Omani route. And when it gets to a stage they don't like, they take some sort of action. This is the action that they've taken this time. They've said, all of these ships, we're watching you. You are under sanction from us. Obviously, that doesn't mean that they can affect banks or anything like that. But the theory is that if you try to come back in the Gulf, we may well shoot at you. Because when you come back in, you're coming back through the Iranian route, and we're going to have words or missiles. So that is essentially what they've done. And the mix that they went for is they went very heavily against UAE ships, ones that are controlled by ADNOC. They went fairly heavily against Qatari, things that have been shuttling for Qatar. They didn't particularly go for Iraq. They went for a couple of Iraqi ships on the product side, not on the crude side, one on the crude side, I think it was. And they didn't sanction many from Saudi Arabia, but given that Saudi Arabia has only done about 8 ships and the PGSA sanctioned 2 of them, it's actually quite a high percentage of the number of ships Saudi Arabia is using. So we can also say that they went fairly heavily against Saudi. Iraq definitely seemed to not be as heavily moved against, but all of them, the PGSA said, it is this shuttling and STS activity. We don't like it. There's too much happening.
And have you seen sorry, just before you move on, and I don't want to derail your train of thought, but have we seen a drop-off in STS activity as a result of that? Is it going dark?
Yes. So let's also put into context, the PGSA announcement and the Scott Bessent D-Day announcement happened within about 24 hours of each other. So you've got 2 major events happening right at the same time. And for at least 36 hours around that time, no VLCCs have left the Strait of Hormuz. Now, is that a sign that VLCCs have stopped? There's no more crude coming out of Hormuz. Everybody panic. No, definitely not. This is more likely a pause than a halt, but it is a trend that is very important to watch. It also takes a day and a half, 2 days for vessels from wherever they are to get to the Strait of Hormuz. So if they decided to pause while they waited for the fallout of the PGSA and the US announcement, they would be restarting. We're not going to see them actually cross the strait until Thursday, Friday, and the weekend. So we'll be in a better position next week to say if this has led to a significant slowdown. But right now, everything is paused.
Right.
And that is significant.
That is significant. And no, I'm very aware of the time. We haven't got long. There is one further topic we must cover. Gentlemen, Iran has come out with a plan of its own to run the strait. So let's just finish by explaining what it's proposing, and of course, what the chances are that Iran's plan will either increase the egress of oil shipments or indeed incur, I guess, the wrath of the United States. Nada, can I start with you? What is Iran proposing today?
Yeah, so I would first to caveat this. it is still very much a proposal, and it's still very much in the works. Yes, the Omanis and Iranians came out with a statement, joint statement yesterday, but there, at least to my eyes, it didn't feel like this is something concluded. The idea here is that essentially they want to go and create or agree on some kind of a new corridor that is not the old corridor, a temporary one, and then which will allow them, give them space to discuss what the future administration of the strait will look like, and then they'll come up with a permanent corridor. One thing that we heard from the Deputy Foreign Minister late last night actually was that this southern corridor, which is the Oman corridor, will be closed. I mean, he basically came and said this is not part of the vision. And from what he's suggesting, the Omanis are on board with that. But obviously it makes sense, because I think this, if the southern one's closed, in theory, the northern one might probably also be closed as well. And then we get back to a situation similar to what we had before. The obvious difference now being that Iran will claim or want to have a say over what happens going forward. We've heard many different versions of this kind of vision for the future. Ultimately, one thing that we need to say, and I was talking to John about this a little bit earlier, whatever is being discussed between Iran and Oman right now is a plan. It is not something that is going to go into effect immediately as soon as these two countries agree. That's simply not going to happen. That's not what this is about. What's happening with the US is a separate issue, and what's happening with Oman is a separate issue. So essentially, and I think we've said this in previous episode, the war has to end, and then what is being discussed will go into effect. So this is just something we need to sort of take into consideration, and not to think, oh, these two countries have succeeded, we're done, we're good, because the US is not technically directly involved in those talks, and they have to be somewhere or another.
Yeah. And John, just in terms of the practicalities of what Nada was saying, this is so Oman and Iran are suggesting that all traffic would be routed through the Iranian corridor?
Yes. So Iran already has kind of two established corridors there, one in, one out. And it looks like what they're proposing is that they will give the out one to Oman, and in exchange, Oman will shutter the Omani route and basically tell people that no one could go along it. This Omani route has been a real flashpoint of the conflict. It's the route that the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, and the US both labeled as free and open, go through here and nothing bad will happen. And it is also where the Iranians are striking exclusively. Every ship that has been struck by the Iranians in the last 4 months has been going along that route. They are clearly very uncomfortable with it. And so they've basically said, yes, okay, instead of having an Iranian and Omani route, we will give you the outbound route, we will keep the inbound route, but it will still go through our waters as a temporary measure. So yes, they are bringing it back into more into their control. It does mean that for ship owners and things going in and out, the PGSA is a US sanctioned entity by OFAC. A lot of ship owners are going to be very uncomfortable dealing with that because they could be subject to secondary sanctions. So Iran will either, and again, as Nader said, not until after the war is concluded. The Iranians will have to set up a new unsanctioned entity if they want any mainstream ship owners to go through there. And certainly if there's anything involving payment. Otherwise, 12 million barrels a day, and you can only move it on, a very, very small number of ships. So there will be.
It would certainly keep
made.
The US sanctioning arm OFAC extremely busy. And on that note, gentlemen, I'm afraid we have to stop. Thank you all so much for dialing in. Please tune in next week for the next episode of Strait Talk. In the meantime, thank you very much to my guests, John 𝗏𝗏, Nada 𝗏𝗏𝗏. And in the meantime, for all of your news, pricing, analysis, and consulting requirements, check out argusmedia.com. Thank you very much, and goodbye.